Hi, how is everyone today? Good. Thank you for coming out on a very rainy Sunday afternoon when you could be napping. I'm surprised you're all here. I'm barely here myself. So if you don't know me, I'm Pooja Nansi. I'm a poet and I work in Singapore. And when the National Gallery first approached me to respond to Lim Cheng Hoe's work, my first concern was, what do I possibly have in common with a landscape watercolorist working in the 50s and 60s. But as I spent a few weeks with Lim Cheng Hoe's diaries, he diligently kept diaries for 40 years of his life, and I spent time with his work, I realized that there were some similarities that happen when you work as an artist in Singapore, regardless of time, space, gender, era. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm just going to lead you through a walk through the gallery where you might see an attempt to build a parallel journey between a man who was born in 1912 in Amoy, China and came to Singapore at the age of 7, and myself. I was born in Baroda, India in 1981, which is about 69 years after Lim Cheng Hoe was born, and I came to Singapore when I was a year old, and yet there were like stunning similarities that I found in the work that we were doing. So just a few ground non-rules. When I'm speaking, please feel free, if you feel excited by any of the paintings, to drift away, look at the paintings. You're not obliged to follow me. It's a free and easy tour. If in the middle of it, everything I'm saying makes no sense to you and you want to leave, you are free to. If you want to stick around till the end, that's great. And just as we enter this next space, maybe just be mindful of the black lines to keep your space from the paintings. So should we begin? Cool. Okay. In 1936, an 18-year-old young man writes in his diary and says, "Drawing is the one subject I like best among the school lessons, and to win recognition in the subject is to find a fraction of my daydreams realized." In 1997, a 16-year-old girl, me, writes in her diary, "I will never be able to be a poet like Sylvia Plath, but if I'm able to somehow put half the emotion she does on a page, I will consider myself a success." So how does one become an artist in Singapore? Where do you go to learn how to become one? Is there a school, a Royal Academy, or can the city itself be a teacher? As I've learned, the education of an artist is problematic. It's never quite adequate. There are always gaps, and the gaps are important. They're what make you go seeking. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you on a walk. I'll ask you questions. I'll make observations. I promise I won't give you any conclusions. So if you follow me. This is Lim Cheng Hoe, aged 18, writing in his diary. "Of late, I seem to have fallen in love with art. How often have I daydreamed and wished that I might become a future Leonardo da Vinci or Landseer. If only my father could allow me to take up art, if only he had the means to support me through a Royal Academy study. I'm not afraid to say I may make something of a painter, and even if I fail, that craving within me to express myself through the medium of painting has been satisfied." Now, remember the first time you heard a piece of music that made your nerve endings come alive, made the small hairs on the back of your neck stand. Remember the first time you read words that had such force they came off the page and settled in your chest. Often wanting to become an artist stems from a strong need to say something, express something you feel you'll never quite finish saying. Many times at the start of this journey, it's also not knowing quite what it is you have to say. So I'm going to flip sides with you now and ask you to have a look at this painting right here. So, to have an art education in Singapore is often to be trapped in our colonial history. As a young person writing poems, this meant hearing about Sylvia Plath, Robert Frost, and Philip Larkin before I ever heard about Arthur Yap, Gopo Singh, or Lee Tzu Ping. Here is one of Lim's earliest paintings, and the first time I saw this, I laughed because of the pompous title, Awaiting Paganini. So it's a work in reference to the 18th century Italian composer Niccolo Paganini, who Lim may or may not have been able to have an emotional connection with. It does, however, betray how as young artists, we believe some things are more worthy of art than other. So what happens when as Singaporean artists, we have no role models to call our own? Where do we go, or who do we turn to move away from imitation and find our own voice? If you follow me. There was a time when I thought to write about this city was one of the most dishonest things I could be forced to do. Another poem about the merlion, an ode to rain trees, another tired sonnet about a hawker center. My mode of rebellion was to steadfastly avoid the city. But your body, like everything else, only makes sense in context. To write about any part of yourself is to realize you exist in a physical space. Your heartbreak happens on specific roads. Your questions make you see skyscrapers differently. Your resolutions depend on the availability of U-turns. To write about any kind of human desire, struggle, and achievement in a city is to write about the city itself. It's to start looking at it with a critical eye. And in Lim Cheng Hoe's case, is to look at it long and hard, repeatedly, and with tenderness. The words of Arthur Yap come to me. So this village is still here without change. And if I stay here any longer, I am already where I shall always be, here without change, in this village, still here. Some things remain, some things pass, some things are tired. Let's take a walk. So if to walk is to lack a space, for Lim Cheng Hoe, to paint was to fill this lack. The body in motion becomes a way for the self to navigate, negotiate an ever-changing world. Lim continued to paint the city, and his work starts anticipating disappearance and loss. To be an artist in Singapore, to want to capture its landscape, is to knowingly engage in futility. We tear down and rebuild our city so much, it's no wonder we have such an identity crisis. This is true even in today's threat to buildings iconic to us like the Pearl Bank Apartments and Golden Mile Complex. Someone once said, if this is home truly, then it should look like home. But leave Singapore for a couple of years and come back, and you might not recognize it. Where once we see Lim using thick, firm brush strokes, we start seeing a disappearing, dreamlike state. This, for me, is an artist immersing himself in the city with a concrete knowledge of loss. The landscapes themselves so translucent, they look like they're dissolving. When I look at these paintings, I see a Singapore I can never inhabit, never visit. Memory is missed. Things fade into the background, but stairs, railings, walls, these things are solid and concrete. They remind us that history is real. My children, if I ever have them, will never be able to visit the spot I had my first kiss. It doesn't exist anymore. To destroy a place while it still means something to its people is a kind of cruelty. A further cruelty happens when people have to continue living in a city that ceases to exist in their lifetimes. Follow me, or you can go around to that wall at the back. This city is surrounded by the result of this cruelty everywhere, surrounded by its ghosts. This is Alvin Pang from a poem called Lost and Found Department. How easily we shed of ourselves, a sports bag, someone's childhood, a peace of mind, a broken heart, a cause, the theme to Hawaii 5-0, virginity, owner please report to the office. All items will be disposed of in a month. A whiff of storm at sea. Your mother's dumplings, the smell of rice, the way your wife used to use her fingers. Here is nothing. You've misplaced nothing. You've lost nothing. Can I invite you to come to this space? This last year, I spent 6 months living in Oxford, next to Port Meadow, which is an endless field, learning myself like you learn another person. Who knew I loved nature, loved being outdoors, found healing in growing things, working with earth? I never knew because my palms have grown up in a city, all polished buttons and steel surfaces, very little dirt. I learnt that I like nothing more than hours alone amidst miles of grass. I am grateful not to see any people, see only vast expanse of sky unspoilt by buildings. One day, coming home after a walk, I read Lim Cheng Hoe's diaries, his thoughts on needing repose to think, to paint, his love for walking, being in nature, sound like words I've been saying to myself. The next day I go walking and I take photographs. 2 months later, I see this exhibition and I'm stunned by what I realize. The next piece I'm going to read you is a combination of original text and found text from Lim's diaries. The photographs I took before I saw this exhibition sit uncannily next to some of his paintings. So I like to think maybe he came on a walk with me. One sunset 30 years before I am born, you sit before a lost place like a camera. Write in your diary, no resolutions this year, not really necessary. If the subconscious prevails to get me more and more involved in painting, other matters like health, like family, should find their own relative levels of importance. One sunset 30 years after you are gone, I stand before a camera, wonder if I'm facing another day of intermittent rain, another day of sitting inside in front of a screen, writing a poem. Washes tend to muddy the painting, you say, leave this kind of paper well alone. Posted by airmail, a belated New Year greeting card finds its way to the UK. In the morning and in bright sunlight, I walk for hours. All my unanswered questions sprouting through the damp earth, ghost limbs, thoughts from another life, from a city I wasn't born in, but whose soil I call my own. From before a night of sleep, from a place that will never be mine. The first time you try to paint trees, you repaint them so many times, they start moving in the wind, start gently laughing. The first time I write about a boy, I rewrite him so many times, I forget what the words mean, and still, I never get his cheekbones right, but his gaze, something about the way he stares into the distance, continues to haunt the poem. Monotony is compensated for by the many turns we take, at each of which is revealed some beauty. So many cold winter days with two of my friends, I walk the longest walk I've ever known, and conversation amongst us is bright. There is much laughter, we're light-hearted in spite of the frowning scenery. The place assumes a different atmosphere. Except for our voices and the sound of our shoes, there is utter quietness. Everywhere, nature stares us in the face, and I realize how soothing it is, how necessary for anyone to spend a moment with solitude when the turmoil of work is over. But dust creeps in, and then darkness, and with it, our deepened anxiety for home. And as I stand alone, I feel a lacking, something wanting. If only time was a watercolor, translucent and luminous, washing away to reveal we are all common nothingnesses underneath. If only despite labor, despite an eroding city, despite growing sickness, we were given all the time in the world to plan and do the only things we want to do: draw and paint, and draw and paint, read, take country walks, listen to the sweetest music. And that's my self-portrait, which is a selfie, which is how we all take self-portraits now. So with that, can I invite you to this section of the exhibition? Can concrete and steel ever replace nature? What sort of resilience does it take to be an artist who is capable of seeing beauty in a city being ripped apart and operated on? How do you commit yourself to painting a city when you have no control, no say over what comes and what goes? And if there wasn't so much being destroyed all the time, would there be so much to remember? So much nostalgia? What about that bench, you might say? What about the way the tree throws its shadow on it? And where will you go now when you need a moment to forget yourself? Won't you miss sitting there? And how can we ever know who we are if everything we call home is constantly being torn down and rebuilt? Not being able to comfortably inhabit your own space is its own kind of identity crisis, its own kind of trauma. This is Lee Tzu-ping writing about the Singapore River cleanup of the 70s. The operation was massive. Designed to give new life to the old lady, we cleaned out her arteries, removed detritus and silt, created a bypass for the old blood. Now you can hardly tell her history. We have become so health conscious. The heart can sometimes be troublesome. I just want to invite you to look at this one last painting. Things change at a manic pace in Singapore. Malls sprout like weed. There are very few spaces where we can sit, be quiet, have repose from constant movement. And when we do find them, even those places are under threat. There's a bridge I spent my youth getting wasted on. Can anyone tell me where this is, if you can guess? Yeah, you're close. It's behind Merchant Court, going to Clarke Quay. My friends and I would buy cheap alcohol from 7-Eleven, sit there for hours, convinced we would never grow old. I've hardly revisited it in the last 10 years, but it's good to know that it's still there. What was once someone's landmark for trade became our landmark for emotional exchange. In some ways, it's optimistic in the face of continuous loss to know that even as some things change, every generation can harvest a space to make their own memories, their own stories. When that bridge inevitably makes way for some new race towards progress and convenience, someone will write a nationalistic eulogy about it. But its grand narrative will have no space for my drunken nights, the time when this city felt most my own. So what do we do as artists in Singapore? How do we as people who want to write about, inhabit, archive, celebrate the city, continue to care for something that is always threatening to evaporate? I'll leave you with the words of Simon Tay. Singapore Night Song. Where no owl cries its kill above city blocks, and the moon does not dominate a night landscape. Stars are as bright as streetlights allow. Headlamps and metal colors, horns and exhausts, car bumpers, the traffic is the only other animal awake. Walk past the Merlion, spotlighted to an edifice field beneath shows. Sidewalk trees shrug off cement with roots. And outside the concert hall, where no concert is being staged, hear the American top 10 spill from a Walkman. You know, nearby, people relish a bite of satay, maybe a walk after that the sun over the telephone wires and sparrows with their gutter songs will eventually come. But neither horizons nor thrushes. If you cannot learn to love, yes, love this city, you have no other. Thank you. That's the end of the tour. Thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon to spend time with me. Please feel free to stay, revisit some of the paintings. I have one more tour happening at 4:30. So if you enjoyed it and you can convince your friends to be dragged out of bed, they must really like you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.